So, I've had some thoughts about the film American Graffiti, and I thought it was time to share a few of them. I do want to make it clear that I'm an amateur and this is just my opinion and nothing more. From the opening shot to the closing credits, American Graffiti is 112 minutes of almost pure nostalgia. Filmed in the summer of 1972 in San Rafael and Petaluma, California, it was released in August of 1973. The film is set in 1962 and is implied to take place in George Lucas's hometown of Modesto, California. The plot revolves around 4 teenagers the night before 2 of them are scheduled to leave town for college. The film became a wild success, earning over $140 million against a budget of $777,000. The percentage return for this film is actually higher than that of Star Wars, even though Star Wars is more well known today. A film that is this successful really deserves to be studied, at least in my opinion. Please note that this analysis and review will contain spoilers for the film. The characters of American Graffiti are 4 teenagers. One is Terry, an awkward high school student, John Milner, a local mechanic who is a popular racer and known for having the fastest car in the valley, Steve, a popular high school student who's recently graduated. I think he was actually also the class president of his high school, and he's determined to leave town and go off to college. And Curt, another recent graduate who's scheduled to leave town for college but is having some last-minute doubts about leaving. Female protagonists in American Graffiti are Debbie, who is a girl that Terry meets and cruises around town with, Carol, a young teen who hangs out with John Milner, Laurie, who is Steve's girlfriend, though they break up, sort of, it's complicated, and then there's the blonde and the T-Bird, who Curt pursues throughout the night. So here's an overview for the plot, because the plot is really 4 storylines. It's really 4 teenagers that are 4 friends that are celebrating this last night before 2 of them leave. There's Terry, there's John, there's Steve, and then there's Curt. Terry, his story is interesting because George Lucas has often said that Terry resembles someone who he used to be when he was in high school early on. Terry's storyline is as follows. Steve, his friend, gives Terry his car while he goes away for college because Steve is going to be out of town and isn't going to need it. Terry cruises Main Street looking for fun and trouble. He meets a young woman named Debbie. And he embellishes and sometimes outright lies while trying to impress her about who he is. Anyway, after buying some liquor, they go to a local creek and get a little intoxicated and act like teenagers. They find later on that the car is lost. They find and recover it, only for Steve to take it back later on. In the end, Terry comes clean with Debbie about who he is, but she still seems to like him. Now, John Milner's storyline is that he starts out cruising Main Street. John inadvertently invites Carol to cruise with him, although she's a very young teenager and far too young for him to appropriately cruise around with. John is pulled over by a local cop named Holstein, and Carol threatens to accuse John of forcing himself on her unless he agrees to show Carol a night out on the town, which is what she wants. He and Carol have a fight and she runs off, but he picks her back up. They get into some wholesome trouble. John takes her to a local junkyard, almost a car graveyard. He has a brief race with Falfa, who's played by the ever enjoyable to watch Harrison Ford. I don't know, I guess you could say Han Solo. John makes a fake pass at Carol to get her to give up her home address so he can drop her off at home. John then preps his car for racing and meets Falfa on Paradise Road. At the end of the race, Harrison Ford crashes the Millennium Falfa. John wins the race, but is convinced his days as a racing legend are numbered. The Steve storyline begins with Steve breaking up with his longtime girlfriend, Laurie. They go to a high school dance and fight, but they keep up appearances. One thing I always noticed here was that Cindy Williams, who plays Laurie, when they share this dance, she's always smiling when the light is facing her, but arguing and fighting and bickering with Steve when the light is not on her, indicating that the character wants to maintain appearances. I always thought Cindy Williams did really well in that scene. I mean, all these actors are just doing an incredible job, but that always stood out to me. They go to a local creek, arguably the same one that Terry and Debbie are at, and they try to rekindle what they had. They get into a bigger fight and Laurie drives off. Laurie wants him to stay, but Steve is refusing to give in. He's insisting that he leaves in the town and goes off to college. Steve goes to Mel's diner alone, and other teenagers circle like vultures, including Boo the waitress, though Steve declines their advances. And Lori joins Falfa. At the race at the end, Steve and Lori come back together and he agrees to stay in town and with her. The final storyline is Curt. His story begins with him receiving a $2,000 scholarship from the local Moose Lodge. Curt tells John that he's looking for a classically beautiful blonde. Later on, he sees a blonde in a T-bird on his way to the high school hop. In what is widely considered, or perhaps narrowly considered, one of the most iconic scenes from the film, Curt returns to the high school that he graduated from and tries to open his old locker, but finds that the combination has been changed and he cannot open it. George Lucas, I believe, mentioned in the DVD commentary that this is highly symbolic of Curt being locked out of his old life and not being able to return to childhood. He asks Mr. Wolf about his reluctance to leave town and finds that there's some sketchiness going on there. He meets his Wendy, his ex-girlfriend, and considers staying in town with her to go to a local college for a year, but he ends up getting kicked out of that car. He runs into a local gang called the Pharaohs. The Pharaohs take Curt to a local miniature golf course that also has a arcade and some sort of a snack bar. And then they proceed to rob the place. Curt then meets Mr. Gordon and Hank, who are either the employees or the owners of the snack bar and arcade. And they are also the local Moose Club members who either nominated and or helped Curt secure the $2,000 of scholarship money and ask him when he's leaving and so on and so forth. Unbeknownst to them, the Pharaohs are, of course, robbing them as they're having this conversation. I guess it's kind of awkward and also kind of funny at the same time. And then they end up pranking a police car. After the prank that results in the rear axle of the local police officer's car being destroyed, the Pharaohs return to Mel's diner and drop off Curt and then tell him that they'll see him tomorrow. At this point, Curt is still arguably undecided as to whether or not he's leaving town, but it does create some tension in that if he remains in town, he might run in with the Pharaohs again and actually have, let's say just a not very good influence on his life. And he visits the Wolfman, the radio guy who's been on the background. After getting the Wolfman to do a dedication to ask the blonde and the T-bird to call Curt at Burger City, which is also seemingly a name for Mel's diner, Curt returns to the payphone by the diner and waits for the blonde and the T-bird to call him. She does, and they talk briefly, but she refuses to give him her name, and instead tells Curt that if he wants to see her, that he should find her on, I think it's 3rd Street, in town that night, cruising, I believe, 3rd Street, if I recall correctly. And at that point, Curt realizes that he has to leave town, and it's debatable whether or not the blonde and the T-bird is actually real or not, or if she's entirely fictitious. At the airport, he receives a send-off from all the characters who have reunited briefly, just to say goodbye to him before he leaves for college. At this point, Curt gets on the plane, and as it's taking off, looks out the window and down at the roadway, seeing the T-bird, the white T-bird there, presumably with the blonde in it. This is the conclusion of Curt's plot. At the very end of the film, a title card briefly describes the fate of the 4 main characters. John Milner was killed in a car crash. Terry Fields is missing in action, which is almost a polite way, well, not technically speaking, but it's heavily implied that Terry is dead in Vietnam. Steve Bolander is an insurance salesman in Modesto, California, which is probably one of the few times that I think the town of Modesto is mentioned directly. In fact, it may be the only time, because I'm not sure if anyone ever says that they're in Modesto. The only other indication is that there's a character who indicates that she is from Turlock, which is somewhere in the valley, which is arguably closer to Modesto than it is to San Rafael or Petaluma. The fate of Curt is that he is a writer living in Canada, with the implication being that he's a draft dodger. This title card is really the one thing that sort of cracks and outright destroys the illusion of nostalgia, the rose-colored glasses looking backwards into the past. With Terry's character arc, one of the things that's apparent at the beginning is that of the 4 teenagers, he's definitely not the most popular one. And you can see that because when Steve gives Terry his car and says that he's going to loan it to him while he's away at college, Terry says that things are going to be different. He also notices, however, that that's really not the case. Even though he does have a car now, it's not going to gain him respect. When he asks out Buddha immediately once he gets the car, she laughs at him and doesn't make any kind of attempt to conceal just how absurd she thinks the idea is. John Milner pulls down his pants in front of everyone as a prank. When Terry begins cruising Main Street in his new wheels, one of the other drivers, or rather a teenager in another car, looks over and just shakes their head saying, "What a waste of machinery." Somebody moons him while he's driving and he looks away. He also challenges another teenager to a race. The other teenager very nonchalantly mentions that his car is more than Terry can handle. And of course, Terry gets into a bit of a fender bender over that. When Terry meets Debbie, he doesn't call himself Terry the Toad, his real nickname, but instead tells her that he is Terry the Tiger to convey perhaps artificial prowess. And that in itself is the beginning of a long series of lies that grow into absurdity, to the point where Terry is telling Debbie that he goes bear hunting and he owns multiple vehicles. The consequences of these lies do eventually catch up to Terry, such as when he throws up after drinking too much, but Debbie tells a stranger that Terry is insistent that he likes to drink. When Steve's car that Terry's borrowing gets stolen, they find it later on, and when Debbie suggests that they should contact the police and wait, Terry insists that they steal it back. It's a bad choice that's meant to conceal all the lies he's told up to that point, since he doesn't want Debbie to learn the truth, that the car isn't his. The lies become apparent when Terry finally drives them to Mel's, and Steve comes and takes his car back because he wants to go find Lori. Terry then comes clean with Debbie, and to his astonishment, Debbie is actually quite understanding and forgives him, telling him that she had a great time with him, and also telling him that his moped was almost like a motorcycle and she loves motorcycles, and that she would like to see him again. This leads to the conclusion of Terry's story, which is that while he has been lying and trying to change who he is through lies, he's actually accepted for who he is, and that he doesn't have to blend in, doesn't have to lie in order to present himself as someone he's not. Instead, he can simply be himself. And that's his character arc. But I guess that's just like my opinion. Now, John's character arc begins with him proactively trying to avoid confronting Falfa, whose name he doesn't yet know, but Curt is very quick to point out that there's someone in town who clearly has a fast car and who's likely to challenge John to a race. But John is clearly avoiding it and afraid of confronting and racing Falfa because that could jeopardize his reputation and social status as having the fastest car in the valley. He inadvertently picks up Carol, who's just a kid, and tries to get rid of her. Carol threatens him with a false rape accusation, which is a rut-row moment for John, and she does this in order to have a fun night out in the town at John's expense. When a police officer pulls over John, he reminds John that it's his birthday and that he's getting older, which is yet another reminder that John is getting older and has to grow up. When John asks Carol to put the traffic ticket in with all the others that he hasn't paid, it's a very humorous moment, but it also adds to the characterization that John doesn't own up to what he's done. He's avoiding accountability and responsibility. At the junkyard, John's eventual fate is foreshadowed as he shows Carol the wrecked cars, of prior races and prior traffic accidents and such. It's actually kind of sad thinking about his eventual fate. They fight considerably, but John does look out for Carol, even going after her when she runs off and is being catcalled by a group of possibly drunk people. When Falfa shows up, it's interesting that Falfa insults John and Carol by claiming that John is babysitting Carol, yet John is the one that defends her from that criticism. Yet John made the same joke about Carol not much earlier in the story. So John then scares Carol into showing him where she lives so he can drop her off before he races Falfa, which is kind of a messed up thing to do, but in a way John is trying to be responsible by keeping her out of danger. And John does win the race, but has to confront the fact that his glory days are numbered and adulthood is coming. It's interesting that there's this shot here of John and Terry and the sun is coming up, and it's almost like the night is over, and it's just like John. He has to confront the day in front of him, whether he likes it or not. But John, in some ways, is much more almost like a symbol in a way. It's almost like in the early 1960s, America was waking up to the reality and the responsibility of being a world superpower following the Second World War. And much like John, it has to accept that things are changing, even though John is afraid for what it might mean. And America very soon is going to have to contend itself with the Vietnam War, drafting, the social and political changes and responsibility that come with being a first world country. Although, I don't know, maybe that's just like my opinion, man. Now, the Steve character arc starts off with Steve breaking up with Lori because he wants to date other people when he gets to college. Now, one thing I noticed was that at the very beginning, of course, Curt and Steve are talking, and Curt is the one who initially has reservations about leaving town, but Steve is the one who's determined and certain he wants to leave this quote-unquote turkey town. Steve does go with Curt and Lori to the local hop. Lori and him fight over the fact that Steve doesn't want change as much as he thinks he does, as among other things, I suppose. They go to a nearby creek to try to rekindle what they had one last time, but they get into an even bigger fight, and Lori drives off, leaving Steve to walk back to town. And back in town, Steve is approached by some teenage girls who spot him alone for perhaps the first time, and even Buddha makes a pass at him. But he realizes that none of them are Lori, and that he won't find Lori somewhere else if he leaves town for college. He races to find Lori at the car race, pulling her from the wreckage before it explodes. He promises to never leave her, and they embrace. And the theme here is that unlike the siren that Curt is pursuing, Lori's love is very real, and Steve will have to leave behind someone and something special he'll never get back if he follows through on his decision to leave. Now, Curt's character arc is that, unlike Steve, he starts off doubting that he should leave town. One of the first conversations Curt has is with John Milner, saying that he wishes he could find a statuesque and traditionally beautiful blonde woman. And interestingly enough, he sees one in a T-bird, and he's determined to find her throughout the night. He goes to the freshman hop, and of course has that scene where he's locked out of his old life and can't return because the locker combination has changed. He talks to Mr. Wolf, who serves as a kind of foil to Curt, and in some ways demonstrates the person that Curt could become if he remains in town, because Mr. Wolf is doing some awfully sketchy things with the young teenage girl students that he has. And Mr. Wolf does encourage Curt to leave, but the sketchiness that's apparent now to Curt sort of seems to tarnish that advice, and leaves Curt probably in a state where he's still not certain what the best course of action is. Now, Curt also sees a T-bird and invades a young couple's privacy, again reminding him that if he stays in the town, he could turn into quite a creep. He meets his ex-girlfriend, and there's a chance of reconciliation, but he ends up being kicked out of the car because Curt is just too Curt for Curt, and that makes him do things that are Curt. And he has a run with the Pharaohs, yet another reminder of what could happen to him if he doesn't leave and he falls in with the wrong crowd. Now, Curt meets the Wolfman and finds that the revered disc jockey who's been in the background of the entire film, sort of acting as a Greek chorus, is in fact just another dude who's stuck in town, much like Mr. Wolf. And while I was taking my notes here, I couldn't help notice the coincidental fact that there's the Wolfman and there's Mr. Wolf, and perhaps that's coincidental in some way. Now, he gets the same advice from the Wolfman as he gets from Mr. Wolf, which is go out and see the world. Yet, the Wolfman, while he's also stuck in town, doesn't seem to be up to anything that's necessarily sketchy. He does lie about who he is, though, which is kind of an interesting fact, because the first time I saw this film, I really didn't understand why he would lie. And it took me a while to really figure out that the Wolfman doesn't want Curt to see who he really is. He doesn't want to be seen as someone who's just stuck in town. He wants to hold on to that larger-than-life image. In a way, you could almost draw a line between the Wolfman and John Milner, because they're both trying to hold on to glory that's long past due. Something else that's notable, and I think there was someone on the behind-the-scenes commentary, or the making of, that mentioned this, but Curt is the one person who is conspicuously absent from the car race at the end, and yet he's also the only one who leaves town. I also thought it was interesting that at the very beginning, when John and Curt are talking to each other, John says something about how, well, if there's someone who wants to race him, they can't find him, they're not worth his time. And Curt makes some comment about how, oh, you're a big shot, John, which is kind of a joke. Yet at the end at the airport, John Milner's the one who playfully smacks Curt and then says, that's a reminder that you're not as much of a big shot as you think. Which is really just John giving the same insult back to Curt that Curt gave to him. Looking at Curt's arc as a whole, it really seems to be the most profound one in the film American Graffiti. According to Lucas, Curt's arc is highly correlated with Lucas's own life and his choice to leave Modesto, California, and pursue his dream of becoming a filmmaker. I don't know what it is because I can't really put it into words, but Lucas has this ability of just portraying characters like they're at the crossroads of destiny. And it's a feeling that's also present in Star Wars. I really get the feeling that Destiny itself is almost like a unseen and unspoken character within Lucas's work, whether it's American Graffiti or Star Wars. It's just something that's almost present in the background. And Curt's storyline, when he leaves the Wolfman's studio, there's just something about that. There's some feeling, I don't know if I can really put into words, I'm really sorry, but it's something that just reminds me of Star Wars, and Star Wars reminds me of American Graffiti and Curt's storyline specifically. I think another aspect of Curt's story that's quite interesting and remarkable is the fact that he really finds very little assistance from other adults in determining what the proper course of action is for him. When he meets with Mr. Wolf, who's presumably a former high school teacher that taught him, and when he was in high school before he graduated, he finds out that Mr. Wolf is a creep. And that seems to have a profound effect on Curt's inability to take Mr. Wolf's advice and apply it to himself. And the Wolfman, the larger-than-life figure who's ever present in the background, turns out to be just another guy stuck in the small town. Now, Lucas mentioned, I think it was on the behind-the-scenes, or the DVD extras, rather, how when he was growing up, he and his friends all thought that DJs knew them personally. It's like, I guess, influencers or celebrities today. And that DJs seemed larger than life, and he thought the radio stations would be these really fancy and upscale places, and when he finally saw one, he was shocked to see that it was really just no different than any other building. And so, with the young people in the 60s listening to the radio all the time, they thought that these DJs were, I guess, celebrities at the time, and it's just interesting that the Wolfman, I think, doesn't want Curt to see him as just another guy stuck in that small town. And it's the shattering of that illusion where Curt thought that the Wolfman was going to have some sort of profound or remarkable thing to tell him. Not that he doesn't, because really he does. The Wolfman has good advice. But he's just not who Curt thought. The blonde in the T-bird really serves as one of the final illusions. She serves as a siren, of course. It's been indicated by multiple commentators. In fact, I think the filmmakers themselves, I don't know if it was George Lucas or one of the other guys on the DVD extras, mentioned that the blonde is clearly a siren whose love is not meant to be real. It's only an illusion to keep Curt from finding his true home, much like in the Odyssey. The siren, literally in that in the old Greek tale, is there to block Curt from finding his true home, really. One of the things that's often speculated, and I'm not sure if this is actually confirmed by Lucas himself, is that the blonde in the T-bird might actually not, in fact, be real. It might be an illusion. And looking back at the opening credits, one thing I noticed during a rewatch recently was that while the 4 male protagonists are listed, the actors playing them rather, when the female protagonists, or rather the actresses portraying them, are listed, there's only 3 names there because Susan Summers is conspicuously missing. It's perhaps possible that her name is not there because the character that she portrays is in fact an illusion and not real. And the other aspect of Curt's arc that's fascinating is that his realization here is that for him to pursue his dream, he has to give up another. And his choice there is really to change. Of the 4 storylines, Curt's is really the most profound and the most interesting and intriguing one. And I can't imagine anyone other than Richard Dreyfuss in this role. I guess that's kind of goes without saying, but then again I said it, so oh well. So one of the things that's very clear to me from a writing perspective is the use in the story of thematic variation, or thematic rectangles as they're called. And this is something that I noticed when I read a book called The Anatomy of Story by John Truby, which I have an image of here in case you haven't read it. It's a pretty decent book about writing screenplays and stories based upon the idea that different characters represent different aspects of theme. Sometimes they represent multiple different aspects of theme, and I'm going to go over that here, at least my interpretation of what this story actually means, and what the characters in it mean in terms of theme. So, one of the first things I noticed is that of the four main male protagonists, each of them represents a different combination of being popular and being either working class or middle class. And if I were to take, for example, Terry, the Toad, he is a working class teenager, and he's also not popular. And one of the things about him and John Milner is that if you look at the way that they dress, you know, both of them are wearing like, you know, casual clothes and you know, like Levi's, for example. And Curt and Steve, the middle class kids, are wearing, you know, button-down shirts and khakis. So you can see that from the way they dress, you have the working class and the middle class is different. Now, John Milner is popular but also working class, in that he's not middle class like Curt or Steve, but he, unlike Terry, is a popular local teenager. He's popular because he has the fastest car in the valley, so he has a claim to fame. And you notice this early on when there's a group of teenage girls driving by, and Curt and John are talking, and they all wave hi to John, but no one says anything to Curt. Steve is an example of a popular middle-class teenager in small-town California in the 1960s. He's the class president, although he has now graduated, and he's very popular, and you can see that later on in his story when he's not with Lori. A number of people, well, by people I mean teenage girls, approach him because they think that he might be on the market again. And then Curt is middle class, but also not very popular. And he's also seen as kind of eccentric, kind of intellectual. And so each of these four characters represents a different combination of these particular themes. One of the other details about the lower class versus the middle class teenagers is that in the very beginning, Curt and Steve are the two middle class teenagers who go to the freshman hop. And it's actually John and Terry who don't. In fact, John is actually kind of offended at the very idea of going to the freshman hop. Presumably, John and Terry, being of a more working class instead of middle class teens, don't have as fond memories of high school, whereas Curt and Steve do. Another theme that plays out, and in some ways you can look at the end title card of the film to sort of confirm this, is that each of the characters represents a different combination of whether they want to leave town and whether they end up actually in fact leaving. Now, Steve is someone who wants to leave town, at least at the beginning of the story, but doesn't end up leaving because he stays with Lori. John Milner is someone who doesn't want to leave and who doesn't leave the town, at least at the end of the story. Now, Terry is someone who doesn't want to leave, but does end up leaving because at the end title card, of course, he ends up presumably being drafted and sent to Vietnam. And then Curt is, of the four teenagers, the only one who has determined, at least at the end of the story, that he wants to leave town, and does in fact leave town. Something else in a more general sense is that this story, at least according to Lucas during the director's commentary, he mentions how the story is really about change. And I thought very carefully about this, and I think that each of the four characters also represents, in a more general sense, whether there's someone who wants to change and whether or not they actually in fact do. Now, John Milner is someone who doesn't want to change, but eventually does. And again, from the end title card, you know that eventually he does actually die in a car race, presumably. And so he doesn't want to face change. He doesn't want his life to change, and yet, in fact, it does. I mean, change is not something that can really be escaped. I think that's really one of the themes of the film, is the idea that change is coming whether you want it or not. And John definitely doesn't want it, but unfortunately, his life does change. Now, Curt is someone who, at the end of the story, decides he does, in fact, want to leave town, go off to the college. And so Curt is an example of a character who chooses to change and also, in fact, does. Terry is someone who initially wants to change, but doesn't actually change. And this is really brought up with the story regarding him and Debbie. Because all throughout the night, Terry is actually lying to Debbie, and the lies become more and more extreme and ludicrous in a way. But he finds out at the end that really he doesn't have to change who he is. That he can actually just be himself, and that there's nothing wrong with him. And of course, Steve is someone who, at the end of the story, he really reveals that he doesn't want to change. And I'm going to get into this more in a moment, but Laurie is actually the one who seems to understand Steve better than he understands himself, and gives him every indication that he, in fact, doesn't really want to change as much as he thinks that he does. And him discovering that fact leads him to, at the end of the story, not wanting to leave town and not wanting to change his situation in life. And he is someone who, again, according to the end title card, he does in fact not change. He stays in Modesto, California, and continues to sell insurance, and presumably is with Laurie still, possibly married to her. And so, of these four characters, they each, in their own way, represent a different aspect of change. Something else that I noticed was that each of the female protagonists, in their own way, is sort of revealing a truth about the male protagonist that they themselves are either not aware of or not willing to accept. And as I mentioned earlier with Terry, him meeting Debbie is very interesting because he's lying to her throughout the night. Instead of calling himself Terry the Toad, he calls himself Terry the Tiger. In fact, at the beginning of the story, he tells, I believe it's Curt, that tonight things are going to be different because he now has a car and he's driving around town and thinks he's going to get respect. One thing that's very apparent is that Terry doesn't really fit in with everyone else. Terry is kind of different. He's kind of more of a bookish, nerdy type. He's actually probably more like Curt than he would like to admit. Debbie is the one person who shows him at the end of the night that he can just be himself. She even tells him that she had a great time anyway. And when he tells her about the fact that he has a moped, or is it moped? I forget exactly what the term is. He has something that's kind of like a motorcycle, and she says that she loves that about him. And so Debbie is really revealing to Terry that he doesn't have to change who he is. He can just be himself. Now, when it comes to John Milner and Carol, it's actually quite the opposite, because John doesn't want to change who he is. He wants to relive these glory days forever. And Carol is someone who is so extremely young that she reminds John that he's actually not as young as he thinks he is, and that at some point in his life he's going to have to grow up, and it's probably going to have to come sooner rather than later. And so Carol, on account of merely being who she is and being a very young person, is a reminder to John that he's an adult and he has to start acting like one. Laurie and Steve is really one of the most interesting revelations, which is that at the beginning of the night, Steve is very adamant that he wants to leave town and he doesn't want to come back. He wants to go off to college and see the world, and that's really why he breaks up with Laurie. Yet throughout the night, Laurie is really the one who's indicating to Steve, through their fighting and through remembering things in the past, that Steve actually doesn't like change as much as he likes to act like he does. She actually knows him better than he knows himself. And unlike Curt, who I'm about to talk about in a minute, Laurie's love for Steve is real. It's a very real thing. And one of the most interesting moments is really, I think, when Steve is alone at Mel's diner and Laurie is outside and some different teenage girls and even Buddha comes up and they flirt with him. And Steve has the revelation that he actually misses Laurie in that moment. That while he might want to go off to college and date other girls, that none of those other girls are Laurie. And that's really what he's going to miss if he leaves. And so at the end, Laurie has actually shown Steve that he doesn't want to leave, and that her love is real and it's worth staying for, even if that means giving up some aspect of the dreams that he had for himself. Curt, of course, has that phone call at the end with the blonde and the T-Bird, and that's really the moment when he realizes that what he wants isn't, in fact, in this town. And it's really fascinating because Steve earlier has some dialogue where he tells Laurie that what he wants in life is not in this town. And although Steve says that, he changes his mind, and Curt is the one who has the revelation that what he wants in life is not here. One of the most interesting things about thematic variation is the fact that by adding layers of thematic variance, you end up with very complicated characters. And so by having characters divided by social class, economic class, by popularity, by whether or not they leave town or not, and by how they fear and sometimes overcome or do not overcome change, as well as the female protagonists that they interact with and are paired up with in some cases throughout their storylines. This is how you build complexity in characters and turn what would otherwise be, say, tropes or caricatures into characters that are actually quite deep and that have a lot of nuance and layers to them. So this is definitely a technique that cannot be overstated, at least in my opinion, from a writing perspective. and from a filmmaking perspective probably as well, although I don't make films. As an addendum, one thing that I thought to add here, and this is not an original idea of mine because I did find some information about this on the internet, is that each character has a car that really sort of represents their background and further serves to demonstrate the variation between the characters and theme. Terry has a moped. He has to borrow a car from Steve, so he doesn't even own a car, actually. John has a 1932 Ford Deuce Coupe, and it's kind of an aged car, although it is the fastest in the valley. Kind of like John himself, it's it's a very fast car, but it's dated and might not be keeping up with the times. Very appropriate car for John to have. Steve has a 1958 Chevy Impala Coupe, which is kind of like a reserved, understated car, something that someone like Steve, who isn't really like big on risk or change, would probably own because it's like a pretty standard car. Now, Curt is a very eccentric person. He has a French-made car. I think it's a Citroën 2CV, according to what I found online, which is a very uncommon car. In fact, I think someone actually told me that the specific model they used in the movie is an anachronism because it wasn't actually available in 1962. But nevertheless, it serves the purpose of demonstrating that Curt is kind of an eccentric person who drives a rather uncommon car. Laurie owns a 1958 Edsel Corsair, which, if you contrast that with, say, John Milner's car or Bob Falfa's car, it's a pretty safe, reliable car compared to the customized hot rods that some of the other characters drive. And so, really taken as a whole, all of these characters made choices in terms of what car they drive, really based upon their personality, which again serves to be a source of variation for character and theme. The main reason I really made this particular video and did this analysis of American Graffiti as a film was really for the purpose of looking behind the curtain and seeing what we can learn as artists about this film. What is it about the process and the ingredients, whether it be the directors, the casting and such, that led it to become such a great film? And also, of course, commercially successful while we're at it. And I broke this down into really two sections, which is what can writers learn and what can filmmakers learn. Now, the sources of this particular section is, of course, the film itself. I also listened to the director's commentary by George Lucas and the making of documentary on the special edition DVD that I believe the one that I picked up was released in 2010. There's also a review by Glenn Erickson regarding the Blu-ray review, and he wrote that review on the DVD Talk DVD Savant website in May of 2011. There's also a lot of others that have contributed, just because this is a film that I've talked about with so many people and read so much about, that really, in terms of this whole video, not every idea presented here is necessarily my own, just because I've talked to so many people about it that I can't remember. One of the things I found was interesting was that John Milner's license plate is actually a reference to George Lucas's first film, THX 1138. Also, I think it's worth noting that you can find the behind-the-scenes extras on YouTube. But is that legal? And I don't really know. I'm not a lawyer. Lucas's director's commentary was recorded presumably in 2010, long after his success and a few years before his sale of Lucasfilm to Disney. The process Lucas describes shows a rare insight into how his creative process worked before the widespread success of Star Wars. Although there is no mention of the hero with 1,000 faces, Lucas's writing style demonstrates at least some knowledge of Campbell's work. Lucas clearly has a love of cinema and a creative ability to innovate, the seed of what would later become Industrial Light and Magic, Star Wars, and Indiana Jones. So now the question is, what can writers learn from American Graffiti? Well, the first thing is really the idea of starting with a great premise. Lucas's story about the making of American Graffiti starts with the commercial but not critical failure of THX 1138. He wanted to make another film, and his friend, Francis Ford Coppola, suggested not making science fiction but something more accessible. The brilliance of Lucas and the premise of American Graffiti is perhaps best summed up by Stanley Kaufman, a film critic quoted by Roger Ebert's review of American Graffiti in August of 1973. And I quote, "Lucas has made a film more fascinating to the generation now between 30 and 40 than it could be for other generations, older or younger." End quote. Although as artists we might loathe the idea of creating around the defiance of marketability, Coppola's advice and Lucas's execution are spot on. This film captures a brief period of the past and presents nostalgia as a palatable theme to an audience eager to return to simpler times, while also deconstructing nostalgia with an opposing theme of change. This nuanced deconstruction walks a fine line between giving the audience what they want and presenting the vision of the auteur, which is Lucas and his theme of embracing change. Another point that writers can learn is the idea of writing what you know, which is something that we often hear. Lucas states during his director's commentary that Terry the Toad is who he started high school as. Then he became someone like John Milner when he began racing cars, and then he became like Curt. The power and relatability of those storylines is due to Lucas's own experience, including having a glove compartment full of traffic tickets and leaving his hometown to embrace his destiny. Destiny being both an artistic and personal theme for Lucas. He also had the presence of mind to defer the details of the Steve and Laurie storyline to writers Gloria Katz and Willard Hayek. I'm sorry if I'm saying Hayek wrong. I'm very Texan. I can't pronounce words like that. But Gloria Katz and Willard Hayek were fellow film students whose backgrounds gave them better knowledge and insight into the Steve and Laurie characters and plotline. In terms of theme and variation, not only are the themes relatable, but they're also woven into the character arcs and narrative structure of the film and story itself. There's often an idea of a microcosm and a macrocosm within a story being defined by both the characters in the foreground and perhaps larger elements in the background. In the making of documentary, Lucas indicated that the characters undergo change just as America is changing. The inner and outer story match, or a microcosm and macrocosm matching the different scopes of theme. John and Carol, for instance, argue over new and old rock and roll, just as America is on the verge of the British invasion of the Beatles. In terms of thematic variation, characters and their arcs express aspects of different themes. There's socioeconomic classes, following their dreams or staying within the confines of their hometown, and whether or not they embrace change. By stacking layers of thematic variation, characters turn complicated with considerable and fascinating depth. Also, pairing up opposite characters, such as Carol and John, or Debbie and Terry, allows for an emphasis to be made on what these characters represent. It also provides characters an opportunity to learn from someone who's vastly different than them. This is often considered to be one of the first films to feature a series of vignettes as a plot. This is disputed by some, though arguably this is the first mainstream and successful film to use this technique. Lucas mentions in his commentary that each storyline is a thin thread, but when intertwined, the threads form a narrative rope that's strong enough to keep the interest of the audience. One challenge posed by this, though, is the editing process. Lucas had 3 hours of film and 4 storylines that needed to be edited down to around 2 hours. This required cutting a small amount from each storyline without any of them becoming too long or too short relative to the others, while also maintaining an engaging narrative. One key feature of the split storylines is that the characters are together at the beginning and rejoin at the very end, allowing for them all to come full circle, even as they undergo character arcs and change. Walter Murch suggested making Wolfman Jack the backbone of the film by featuring the radio throughout the narrative. Lucas mentioned that at the time he thought the fact that teenagers thought radio DJs were personal friends despite never meeting them was a novel concept, though with social media today this is no longer a novel concept according to him. There's also a notion that Walter Murch introduced that Wolfman Jack is in some ways kind of like a Greek chorus from olden times, and that in Greek theater there would be a chorus in the background that would explain events. This was recently used in the film Dunkirk, in which, I'm trying to remember his name, I think it's Kenneth Branagh, and maybe it was Ralph Fiennes. I'm sorry, I can't remember the other actor because I haven't seen Dunkirk in a while. But they act as characters that are explaining the events so that the audience has someone that they consistently look to in order to see what's happening. Here, Wolfman Jack is not really explaining events, but he forms sort of the tone, and given the fact that many of the songs are playing on the radio, he's actually managing really like the tone of different scenes that are being expressed. On the making of DVD, Lucas mentions the fact that when this film was made, it was considered avant-garde, and that he deliberately made the film that way because he was trying to break the confines of convention and actually reinvent what art and filmmaking could be. This is definitely something that writers can learn from too. He also mentions that now that he's made American Graffiti, anyone trying to replicate the formula is perhaps doomed to failure because it's been done in the past, and therefore you actually have to find something that's new, and something that's not formulaic. You draw interest by trying something new and different, not something that's already been done. Also, art is a risk. THX1138 was a commercial failure, but I have the Blu-ray and consider it an artistic success. American Graffiti is the other side of the risk coin, not that of commercial failure, but of commercial success. I would still say it's artistically successful as well. Now the question is, what can filmmakers learn about American Graffiti? In some ways, looking at what made this film a success lends one to think that it was probably lightning in a bottle. And this is certainly, I think, in some ways the opinion that I took away from Glenn Erickson's article that he wrote in 2011. I also think in some ways that this reminds me of The Empire Strikes Back, another film that was created by Lucas but not directed by him, which is also considered one of those films in which it was really a convergence of all the favorable elements of writing, casting, and directing coming together and making something that was unforgettable. One of the first things to examine in the process of this film was really the idea of casting. And a lot of credit has to be given to, I believe the guy's name is Fred Roos, who was the casting director. He was actually worked with Francis Ford Coppola on The Godfather, so he certainly had a background in casting. One of the key things that Lucas wanted to accomplish was the pairing of opposite characters and opposite performers, such as Mackenzie being one of the youngest actresses on the film, and Paul Lamont being one of the oldest, and that by pairing them up, they actually couldn't help but act like their characters in terms of the awkwardness between them generationally. Lucas also cast actors that were very much like the characters that they were portraying. He actually mentioned that this was in some ways due to the fact that the film had a very short production schedule. He didn't have the time to be what's commonly called an actor's director. He had to be very efficient, and it was much easier to cast actors that were like the characters. Another aspect of the success here is the fact that many of these actors were theater trained, such as Charles Martin Smith. Also, the filming itself was technically innovative in that Lucas often employed two cameras and would film both sides of one conversation at once. This allowed him to not only cut down on filming time and production time, but also lended to better performances because both of the actors are literally talking to each other in real time instead of the camera panning to one side of the conversation or the other. Lucas mentions on the commentary track also that he believes the source of Harrison Ford's success to be that he's an inventive actor who's 50% funny and 50% serious, and it's very hard to do both. He also mentions that Curt was an intellectual part and role, and that Dreyfuss was an excellent choice because he could convey, really just by expressing himself quietly, the intellectual parts of the Curt role. Despite the small budget, Lucas was able to get Coppola as a producer and Haskell Wexler as a visual consultant or a camera operating consultant. For a film that's being shot entirely at night, an expert like Haskell Wexler was able to really operate the camera and achieve a result that was visually stunning, considering the technical limitations present at the time. One of the ideas that they tried doing on this film was to record sound with moving microphones and mimic a real environment. For the sock hop scenes, they moved microphones on a platform to record the sound of the music bouncing off walls within a high school gymnasium, something that couldn't be done with sound mixing or equipment at the time. Sound was also recorded from moving cars as they passed by, and the radio station was sourced from several cars to give the impression of it being part of the cruising strip's ambience. The camera used here was, according to what I found, a 16mm for an edgy look, with a documentary style which fit the movie perfectly since it takes place in the past. One particular scene that stuck out is when Curt is running through traffic and cars are honking their horns at him. In any other style, this would be a suspenseful moment, but Lucas's style is to merely point the camera and observe. This leads the viewer to assign the meaning of scenes to themselves via an objective lens, despite the fact that Lucas is an auteur with a clearly defined theme. In terms of looking at Lucas as a director, my conclusion is that Lucas is underrated considerably, and his artistic choices and ability to innovate the way films are crafted is really what makes him into a legend. Another aspect of Lucas's success in this film is the fact that he chose to work in the San Francisco area primarily to remain far from Hollywood and studio interference, though that did not stop executives from trying, according to him. There is an iconic story of Francis Ford Coppola pulling out his checkbook and offering to buy out another producer who was doubtful the film would succeed. It's also worth mentioning that Universal Studios only agreed to make the fixture due to Coppola producing it. Much like today, Hollywood won't take a risk unless a famous name is attached to the project. Test audiences were the only thing that saved this film from being released as a TV movie, which is quite astonishing to think about today. The key takeaway here is that Hollywood has to be saved from itself on occasion. It's creatively bankrupt at times. It's often said that studios are reactive and not creative. The success of this film is another example of out-of-touch producers having more authority than intelligence. But don't listen to me, I've worked in the corporate world for 25 years, so I'm a little bit bitter and jaded. Any serious filmmaker should seek opportunities to remain independent and retain creative control of their projects whenever possible. At least in my opinion. The film is made up of many little things with a realistic degree of intensity. The water fight scene in particular is about one thing in real time, according to Lucas. Lucas also said he wrote this more for themes than plot, and that each story is a complete plot. Milner and McKinsey saying goodbye, Curt in the radio station, the regrouping at the end. The production itself was filmed in sequence, so while the actors look more tired as the film progresses, and it's actually because the performers themselves were not sleeping very well, and because they were sleeping during the day and working at night. Ironically, their increasing fatigue fits the narrative, since the characters themselves are supposed to be staying up all night. In terms of the use of music, no film had this much music before, which posed a problem for studios since they had never considered how to secure the rights and budget for such an expense. There's a noticeable absence of Elvis on this film due to the cost being prohibitive. Films licensing music instead of composing their score has since become conventional. This is the first movie to produce and sell its own soundtrack. On the making of documentary, Walter Murch mentions how the sound was recorded, how microphones were used to record music in alleyways and gyms and real environments to simulate how it would sound in the world of the film as though you were there. This technique was revolutionary for the time and fits with Lucas's documentary directing style. The song Smoke Gets in Your Eyes in particular was recorded to sound like a memory, how one recalls the song from their mind. And that's actually a really good insight from Walter Murch. One of the comments that Lucas made about the use of music in this film is that most films use music for mood and sound effects for realism, yet in some ways Lucas did the opposite here. He used music for realism and sounds, such as those at the creek, the train station, and the silence at the junkyard for mood. The music that Lucas deliberately selected was in the period between the death of Buddy Holly, but before the British invasion, the Beatles. One of the most fascinating things I heard about George Lucas is something called auteur theory. And there's actually a YouTube video by a guy named Rick Worley about how to watch Star Wars that goes into this in incredible detail. But auteur theory is just the theory that the director is the primary creative driving force of the motion picture. One of the most fascinating things about Lucas's directing style is the fact that he uses what's called a documentary directing style. Using a style that's considered that of a documentarian means that the camera and action don't appear staged, but merely as an observer of what's happening. Compared to other directors, Lucas doesn't move the camera for fancy techniques, but instead has the camera move naturally, as though it's capturing a real moment. This is not only apparent from the final product in terms of framing, mise-en-scène, etc., but the making of documentary reveals that Lucas told the actors to change any dialogue they wanted during production. In fact, Ron Howard mentions this specifically. This led to natural conversations between the performers, and Lucas often selected imperfect and flawed takes to reinforce the documentary style and create a natural story that seems more believable due to the imperfections. Something Charles Martin Smith mentions in the making of documentary is that Lucas was so determined to make this in a documentary style that he didn't do his own blocking. He told the performers to stand wherever they wanted. This led to more natural positioning between the characters and the performers themselves. According to the actors on the behind-the-scenes documentary, Lucas almost comically would use the word terrific whenever the actors asked for feedback. This reminds me in some ways of the fact that while filming Star Wars, he always said faster and more intense, according to Carrie Fisher and Mark Hamill, and I think Harrison Ford might have said that too. But Lucas really was determined to shoot the film in a documentary style for the sake of realism. Also, Lucas was quoted at one point in time as telling someone that due to the short production schedule, his directing choices are really going to be made in the editing room and not during the filming process. Lucas also said that he wanted improv just to see what would happen. Both Candy Clark and Charles Martin Smith often recount the fact that during production and during filming, Lucas would deliberately use takes with mistakes. As an example, Terry crashing the Vespa in the beginning, Charlie let the clutch out in the first gear and accidentally crashed, and according to him, he waited for Lucas to say cut because he thought that he had made a mistake. But fortunately, Charlie was a theater-trained actor, and so once he realized that Lucas wasn't going to stop the scene, he simply got on with it and continued as the character would. Also, Charles Martin Smith nearly dropped the bottle of booze during the store robbery, and he recounts how during multiple takes he caught the bottle properly, but that the one that Lucas used in the final film was the one where he almost made a mistake and almost let the bottle hit the ground and possibly break. Charles Martin Smith also indicated that to him it seemed that, like at times, that Lucas would continually do takes of a particular scene until somebody made a mistake. Candy Clark also recounts how she flubbed her line when Terry comes back to her car. She says, "Did you get it? Did you get it?" more than once, and that it was a source of embarrassment for her. I think actually Candy even said that this was the first take, but because she actually messed up the line, Lucas stopped right then and there and said, "That's what we're going with." much to her chagrin. Also, when Carol is hit with the water balloon, she was supposed to be angry, and the water balloon was actually supposed to miss her, but crash nearby or splash nearby and get water all over her face, but it actually hit her right in the face. Despite the fact that the scene was written for Carol to have an angry reaction, Mackenzie recounts how she couldn't help but actually laugh, and because it was a natural reaction, Lucas kept that in the final film. One of the things I like about Charles Martin Smith is that, like Dreyfuss, he can make awkwardness look natural. Despite the documentary style that Lucas chooses to film with, he still employs techniques that could be considered what's called mise en scène, which is really, it's French for basically like the way that you structure a scene, or in the way that you film a scene. I'm oversimplifying here because I'm not a film student or a filmmaker, but you structure a scene visually in a way to represent something thematically. As an example, when Curt goes to talk to Mr. Wolf, noticeably there's a fence between the camera and Mr. Wolf and Curt. It's actually showing in a way almost like the bars of a prison. Because during this scene, Curt is actually talking to Mr. Wolf about possibly being stuck in town and being unable to leave. And by framing the shot this way, you can actually see that Mr. Wolf is in effect in a prison, whether it's mental or physical, but certainly symbolically and in some ways trapped in this town. Also, when Curt goes to see the Wolfman at the radio station, there's a mirror. Curt is literally self-reflecting on his choice, his struggle with destiny. And in the mirror, or the glass there, you can see that there's actually two Curts, because at this point in time, Curt has two possible destinies. The Wolfman being framed in the window might be really an indication that he's stuck too, that he's trapped behind the glass. When Curt leaves the radio station, there's only one Curt, because he notices the Wolfman is just another dude trapped in his hometown. It's at this point that Curt decides he's going to embrace his destiny and leave. I think in some ways, if you want to study Lucas as an auteur, the best source, of course, is really naturally Lucas himself. On the director's commentary, he indicates that his ambition at the time, at least, of this filming, was to be the American version of Goddard. If you know who Goddard is, I forget his first name, but he was the guy who made, I think it was, it was that film, Band of Outsiders. If you've seen a Quentin Tarantino film, I think his production studio is called A Band Apart, which is like the translation of the Band of Outsiders is from French or something like that. Lucas's opinion on art itself is really that avant-garde is what is needed, and that's again what writers and indie authors and filmmakers can learn. What really comes through here is Lucas mentions that filmmakers in the 1970s were the first class to come from film school and study the craft, and following the early frontiers of Hollywood, Lucas is part of the generation that reinvented how films were made. Lucas is clearly a risk-taker, and that's reflected in the choices he made. Also, Lucas mentions that people made films in the 70s because they cared. They were sincere about the stories they told, and really that's why they became filmmakers in general. Not to become wealthy or anything, but because they cared and they wanted to tell stories. They had something to say. At the conclusion of the director's commentary, Lucas says, what the film is really about is that you can't live in the past. Everything is changing and you have to accept change. That's not just a good theme, but that's really good life advice. I think that Lucas's insights are still relevant to any filmmaker today or any writer today. I think in conclusion, I think that really the success of this film is truly a lightning in a bottle phenomenon. A combination and intersection of both preparation and good fortune aligning to create an unforgettable film. There's a lot to learn by studying this film, and even if you don't want to study it, I hope that you can enjoy watching it. My opinion on this film is that I agree with George Lucas. This film is dated, but it still has its charms. And if for any reason, I like it for that. One of the things that George Lucas said in the making of documentary that I found particularly interesting was the use of music, and how he would listen to a particular track of music while writing that would later be used in the film. And although most of the time it's used to convey a specific mood, there do seem to be times, by Lucas's own admission, it seems, that there was a possible literal interpretation or connection between the music that was chosen and the scene that was currently playing on the film. The first song that plays is Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and his Comets. This begins at the 1 minute mark. And the image that begins the film is Mel's diner at sunset. And this plays as the sun is going down and the teenagers will be up all night. So these teenagers are literally going to rock around the clock and stay up all night before going their separate ways. The theme here is really one of teenage rebellion. There's also a movie called Blackboard Jungle that came out in 1955 that also used the same song. The second song that plays in the film is 16 Candles by the Crests. This is the first image of Mel's at night. It begins with Buddha skating around, delivering food. Curt and Milner discuss the fact that Curt is looking for a dazzling blonde or beauty. Steve and Laurie also break up while this song is playing, and Terry hassles Buddha, presumably for something, I don't know. But the song is clearly conveying a tone of teenage love, 16 Candles. In fact, I looked up some information on this, and the song itself is actually about an old tradition where a girl on her sweet 16 would receive 16 candles, and each of those candles would be for someone in her life, starting with her parents, siblings, and friends, and the 16th candle is presumably for a male love interest, or just a love interest in general, I suppose. The third song that plays is Guy by the Crows. When this is playing, Curt approaches his sister Laurie, and Laurie insists that there's nothing wrong, even though clearly she is upset. Steve gives Terry his car, and John pulls down Terry's pants as a prank. The fourth song that plays is Runaway by Del Shannon. This plays while Terry and John Milner are separately cruising Main Street. Based upon what I found online, the song is about losing love and trying to get it back, and both John and Terry are, in fact, cruising Main Street looking for a young lady to pick up and drive around with. The fifth song is Why Do Fools Fall in Love by Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers. This plays while Curt sees the blonde in the T-Bird, and John picks up Carol. And this is interesting because John and Curt are both sort of chasing illusions. John picks up Carol, or rather offers to drive around with her, not knowing how young she is. And Curt is enamored by the blonde in the T-Bird, who is really an illusion or a siren. The sixth song that plays is That'll Be the Day by the Crickets. And I love this one because it's Buddy Holly. How can you not love a rock song by Buddy Holly? Let's be real. This plays while Carol enters John's car. Now the song is, according to what I've found online, is that the song is about the disbelief and fear of breakup. And John doesn't want Carol. In fact, Carol even tells John, nobody wants me. And also this fits John's character because he tells Carol later on that rock and roll has been going downhill ever since Buddy Holly died, so having a Buddy Holly song play is kind of fitting in a way. And the song also ends shortly and abruptly as she enters the car. It's interesting that later on a Beach Boy song plays, and that's when John mentions the fact that rock and roll is going downhill. And in fact, Carol is wearing a surfing t-shirt, but I'll talk about that later when we talk about the Beach Boys. The seventh song that plays is Fannie Mae by Buster Brown. This song plays while Terry attempts to race another teenager, but he ends up backing out into another car and causing a fender bender. The theme of Fannie Mae, based upon what I could find from research online, and by that I mean Wikipedia, is that Fannie Mae is about a troublesome woman. But I don't really know how that fits in with the theme of the particular scene, because it's really just Terry being Terry. But I don't really know, I guess. The eighth song that plays is At the Hop, performed by Flash Cadillac and the Continental Kids. I don't think they're the original artist, though. I forget who is. I'm sorry. And I'm sorry for apologizing too much. But it plays when they're at the literal hop, and Laurie is kind of depressed at the fact that Steve and her are breaking up, that Steve dumped her. The ninth song that plays is She's So Fine, performed by Flash Cadillac and the Continental Kids. Again, they're the performer, but I don't recall the original artist. I think it might be a different band. This plays when Laurie declines to dance with Steve and instead dances with Eddie. I think the theme here is really that Steve is being reminded how wonderful Laurie is, or rather how fine she is. The 10th song that plays is The Stroll by the Diamonds. Supposedly there's some kind of a dance called the Stroll Dance, which I don't really know what that is, but apparently there would be a division between men and women forming parallel lines, and then there would be a couple that would stroll between those two lines one at a time. I can't help but find it interesting that this song is playing in the background as Curt is going to find his old school locker, and actually he tries to get into it, of course, and he finds that he's locked out. But what I found really interesting about that is that it made me remember that when I was in high school, and I don't know if this is still done or if this is commonplace, but when I was in high school, the lockers were, of course, separated on two sides of the hallway, and they were actually separated by gender at the time. So if you were a guy, you were on, like, I think the left side, and the girls were on the right. I don't know if they still do that again, but that actually reminded me that maybe that's actually the visual comparison, is that the Curt looking at the lockers is meant to sort of parallel the stroll dance that's happening in the hop, or in the gymnasium where the hop dances or whatnot. But again, I don't really have enough information to know if that was deliberately done. Maybe I'm reading into things too much. The 11th song that plays is See You in September by the Tempos. And this occurs while Curt is talking to Mr. Wolf, who encourages him to go out and explore the world and go off to university. It's very fitting because See You in September is something that I think a long time ago college admissions letters would say See You in September. In fact, I think it's a pretty common phrase. Looking up information on the song online indicates that it's about losing a summer romance in September due to having to leave. And it's kind of fitting that Curt is afraid of leaving without finding out who the blonde of the T-Bird is. And of course, Mr. Wolf is the one encouraging Curt to leave, and yet Mr. Wolf is the very type of person Curt could eventually turn into if he doesn't overcome his fear of change and leave the town. The 12th song that plays is Surf and Safari by The Beach Boys. By the way, rest in peace, Brian Wilson. So this occurs while John and Carol are driving, and Carol has the Dewey Weber surfboard shop shirt on that she wears throughout the night. And I thought that was really interesting because John talks about how rock and roll has been going downhill ever since the death of Buddy Holly. Carol actually does like the Beach Boys and is wearing a shirt. And this, again, becomes something of representing a theme through the characters, because Carol is, of course, much younger. She's embracing new music. And John is still kind of living the past in terms of his appreciation for pop culture, and shows that he's getting older than he would care to admit. By the way, fun fact is that in 1962, the song only reached 14 on the Billboard Hot 100. Although, I mean, I thought it would have been higher. But anyway. The 13th song is He's the Great Imposter by the Fleetwoods. Now, this song is playing while Milner is being pulled over by the police officer. Terry also speaks with Falfa. I think this song is still playing. I can't help but wonder if this is related to the fact that John is pretending to be a law-abiding citizen to the cop, and even though he has a bunch of parking tickets or traffic tickets inside of his glove compartment. Also, Carol threatens to falsely accuse John of doing something awful to her. And it's kind of interesting because, well, is John just an imposter? Is he not really acting like an adult, or not really a law-abiding citizen? The 14th song that plays is Almost Grown by Chuck Berry. This song plays while Terry picks up Debbie. But the song Almost Grown is about a young man who has a job, car, and is on the cusp of adulthood. And Terry has Steve's car that he's borrowing, and he's going to pick up Debbie, and he is in fact almost grown. So that seems to be the connection between the song and the scene. The 15th song that plays is Smoke Gets in Your Eyes by the Platters, which I gotta say is a very classic song. That's also the title of the first episode of the show Mad Men. Now, in this scene, Steve and Lori dance, but they're angry at each other, and she tears up, kind of like smoke gets in her eyes. And she tells him to go to HE double hockey stick at the end. Now, the theme, according to the internets, is that Smoke Gets in Your Eyes is really about the pain of loss and finding love, and how you realize the truth too late, which is that the love wasn't real, or it's not meant to last, and it's the smoke and the flame, and I don't know. There's a bunch of information. You can Google it if you want, because they'll probably explain it better than I will. But it seems like an appropriate song for these two to be dancing, and yet they're upset or angry at each other, or at least Lori is at Steve. So I think it applies really to the breakup between them. The 16th song is Louie Louie, performed by Flash Calic and the Continental Kids, although I always remember the Kingsman version because that's the first one I heard. So this particular song was actually cut from the theatrical release because the entire scene was gone. It's the one where Steve tells a former teacher or the principal to go suck a duck. And the original song is about a sailor who has to ship out and leave his lover behind, kind of like Steve and Lori, that they're experiencing at the moment. Although I remember the original version by the Kingsmen, I had no idea what the lyrics were other than Louie Louie. The rest of them were incomprehensible to me. The 17th song is Little Darlin' by the Diamonds. This plays while Terry and Debbie go to Mel's Drive-In and order some food. This is yet another love song, very common for the 1960s, it seems. But it was about a more serious... but supposedly the theme of this song is actually about a more serious and nuanced and sincere connection between two people. This coincides with Debbie noticing and telling Terry that he's different and smart compared to other guys she knows and has dated, and it begins to show that these two are connecting and progressing into something beyond superficial attraction. The 18th song is Peppermint Twist by Joey D and the Starlighters. This song plays while Bobby is chasing the white T-Bird for Curt, because he's a passenger of the car and Bobby's driving. The song is about a type of dance and could be about Curt chasing the blonde all night being compared to a dance of sorts, almost like a cat and mouse game, or a dance, either way. The original version of the song was supposedly too long to fit on a single side of a vinyl record, meaning both halves of the song were always separated. And I wondered about this because I wonder if this was symbolic to the point in which this could be about Curt and the blonde being permanently separated, or Curt's attempts to reconnect with his ex-girlfriend also being doomed. But I could be overthinking things. The 19th song that plays is I always say Barbara Ann, but it's Barbara Ann by the Regents. And this plays while Curt and his ex-girlfriend are making out in the back of Bobby's car. Curt gets kicked out and he runs after the white T-Bird and has to stand in the middle of traffic and not get run over. The song itself is about being infatuated with a young lady, and Curt is, of course, infatuated with the blonde and the T-Bird. The 20th song that plays is The Book of Love by the Monotones. This plays while Curt is in the street, John and Carol are at Mel's, and Carol runs off and is catcalled by a group of possibly drunk people. John goes after her, comes to her aid. Curt, of course, is experiencing the illusion of love, and John and Carol call each other cousins jokingly. It seems that this song is really about John and Carol. There's clearly a concern for each other, something platonic between them. The song itself is about the different stages of love, including fighting and reconciling, and John and Carol kind of go through this in a matter of minutes in the entire scene, because they start at Mel's with him getting her I think it's a cherry Coke, and then John tells two people that he's actually babysitting Carol, which angers her and she runs away, but then he comes back and then they quickly reconcile. The 21st song that plays is Maybe Baby by the Crickets. This plays while Terry is at Gillard's liquor store. The song seems to be about Terry and Debbie. He's hoping he can get liquor and that Debbie will love him the way he loves her. Literally, maybe baby. I don't know, maybe. The 22nd song is Ya by Lee Dorsey. This song plays while Terry has a problem buying liquor, asks Debbie for $1, pays a guy to go buy him a bottle of booze, who then turns out to be a robber who tosses him a bottle. I really think that this song was probably chosen mostly just because it's a very energetic song and it matches the robbery and the absurd pent-up energy of the scene. Also, a note that when they're at the junkyard, there seemingly is no music at all, almost like it's a cemetery. The dead hear nothing, and it's a kind of a bad omen in terms of John's eventual fate. The 23rd song is The Great Pretender by the Platters. This plays when Curt unwittingly meets the Pharaohs because he's leaning against a car and they claim to know the owner and take great offense. I wondered at first if The Great Pretender was really about the Pharaohs themselves putting on a tough guy act, because when Curt himself pretends, maybe he in fact does know, someone named Toby Juarez, who is a Pharaoh, the Pharaohs immediately say that they tied Toby to a car and dragged him and that they killed him last night, which doesn't seem likely to be true, because it seems like if that were to happen, that there'd probably be quite an uproar in town if there was a murder. But nevertheless, the Pharaohs do seem like pretty serious tough guys. The 24th song that plays is Ain't That a Shame by Fats Domino. This song is playing while Curt is forced to accompany the Pharaohs, and he's trapped in the Mercury coupe while he sees the white T-Bird outside with the blonde in it. And so it is quite literally a shame that he can't go talk to her. It's also a shame that he's being pulled into this Pharaoh drama. The 25th song is Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry. Now this song does play when Carol seemingly makes a move on John and he tells her to get back into her corner. And also a group of teenagers throws a balloon and hits Carol, and they shaving cream a car. And so it could literally be that Johnny Be Good is in fact meaning that John should be good. I don't know, maybe. The 26th song is I Only Have Eyes for You by the Flamingos. This plays while Terry and Debbie are at the canal, and Terry clearly only has eyes for Debbie. The 27th song is Get a Job by the Silhouettes. This plays while the Pharaohs are at the arcade or miniature golf and they're robbing the place for gas money. And the pharaohs presumably have to do this because they will not get a job. Also, job rhymes with rob, so I don't know if that's like intentional or not. The 28th song that plays is To the Isle by the Five Satins. This plays while Steve and Laurie are at the canal. The song is about meeting a girl and getting married, which Steve and Laurie presumably do eventually, since he stays in town. The 29th song is Do You Want to Dance by Bobby Freeman. This song plays while John wants to take Carol home, and Carol says that she wants some action in a wholesome kind of way. Also, this plays while John and Falfa briefly race on Main Street, which could in fact be interpreted as some kind of a dance between them, I guess. The 30th song that plays is Party Doll by Buddy Knox. This plays while Curt and the Pharaohs discuss The Blonde and the T-Bird, and Joe indicates that the Blonde and the T-Bird is in fact a call girl or prostitute. The 31st song is Come Go With Me by the Del Vikings. This also plays while Curt is flipping off the cop car, or provoking it or something. I don't remember exactly what it is. Some of the lyrics of the song, including Across the Sea, might in some way factor into the Blonde and the T-Bird, since she's a siren, and in the Odyssey, Odysseus is tempted by a siren while at sea. Or it could be related to Curt leaving and going far away, like literally across, really not the sea, but to the other side of the country for school, college. The 32nd song is You're 16, You're Beautiful by Johnny Burnett. This song plays while John drives Carol home, or rather threatens to find out where she lives. This also plays while Steve and Buddha are flirting. The song itself is about young women on the cusp of adulthood having an innocent crush, and Carol clearly has a crush on John, although it seems to turn out to be rather platonic and innocent. The 33rd song is Love Potion No. 9 by the Clovers. This plays as Curt and the Pharaohs celebrate their destruction of the axle of the cop car, and Curt tells them that he has to go find that blonde. So the song is about a potion for love that backfires. In a way, it warns Curt about becoming like Mr. Wolf, and about his obsession to find the blonde and the T-Bird. The 34th song is Since I Don't Have You by the Skyliners. This plays while Laurie goes into Falfa's car because she doesn't have Steve, and John drops off Carol, kisses her on the cheek, but he's too old for her. He gives her his gear shift, and I do like the fact that he waits for her to go inside before driving away. I have a feeling that the theme of this song is really tying into Steve and Laurie's breakup more than anything else. The 35th song is Some Enchanted Evening, and it's cut from the theatrical release. It was really improv by Harrison Ford, so I'm not sure it counts as theme because I don't think it was a factor while writing if it was improv. The 36th song is Chantilly Lace by the Big Bopper. This plays while Terry tries to steal Steve's car back and gets beat up. The 37th song is Teen Angel by Mark Dinning. This plays while John Milner comes to help Terry and Debbie calls John Milner the Lone Ranger, or compares him to the Lone Ranger. So John is effectively the teen angel that shows up to save them, supposedly. At the same time, Terry also introduces Debbie as the love of his life, so maybe it's about Terry thinking of Debbie as a teen angel. Also, Terry tells Debbie the truth, and she's kind about it, so I guess that also makes her kind of an angel. Or maybe just a good person. I don't know. What's the difference? The 38th song is Crying in the Chapel by the Orioles. This plays while Terry and Debbie chat. Also, it plays while Curt drives to the Wolfman's broadcast station. I really wonder if this is really about the radio station more than anything else, because it seems like for these teenagers, the radio is almost like some sort of a religious experience, like it's a way of life, and going to the broadcast station where radio programs are being broadcast is almost like going to the chapel of the radio religion at the time. It's just something that's very culturally significant. One of the things that I think Lucas mentioned on the behind-the-scenes making-of documentary is that I think he said that at one point he went to a radio station. He was expecting it to be like gilded with gold practically, because the radio was such a big deal to basically everyone back then, but he was astonished to find that it was simply a unremarkable and Spartan building that was nowhere near what he imagined it was. The 39th song that plays is 1,000 Miles Away by the Heartbeats. This plays while the Wolfman tells Curt to go to school, presumably on the East Coast, 1,000 miles away perhaps. The 40th song that plays is Heart and Soul by the Cleftones. The usage of this song is actually one of my personal favorite usages throughout the film. It's not my favorite song, it's just my personal favorite usage of a song in the film. Plays while Curt and John Milner have parallel journeys of change, and they reach a crossroads of destiny with only one of them making a turn. Now, the song starts playing when the Wolfman's identity is revealed to Curt. Even the Wolfman is just a guy stuck in town. This is arguably the moment Curt decides to embrace the fear of change, and he shows heart in the face of fear. This is also the song that's playing while Milner decides to race Falfa despite his fear of losing. The 41st song is Green Onions by Booker T and the MGs. This song plays while the car race is being set up. It's also a really cool tune that was in the film Get Shorty, which was released in 1995. The 42nd song is Only You by the Platters. This song plays while Terry tells John that he'll always be number one and he'll always have the fastest car in the valley. It also plays while Steve and Lori reconcile. They only have each other. This also plays while Curt has his phone call with the blonde. The 43rd song is Goodnight, Well It's Time to Go by the Spaniels. This plays while Curt goes to the airport in the morning and Curt is leaving, and it is literally time to go. The 44th song is All Summer Long by The Beach Boys. Again, rest in peace, Ryan Wilson. And the song is playing while the credits roll all summer long, but the film is ending and summer is over. And that's that. Now, there are some alternative versions of this film. The theatrical release came out in 1973, of course, and there was also a 1978 re-release that was presumably, I think, VHS. I know that my parents at one point in time had a VHS copy of the film that they picked up in the late 70s, and they noted that there were some differences between the two. The car salesman with Terry is a scene that was added in. It was not present in the theatrical release. Also, the Louie Louie dance sequence in which Steve calls a former teacher of his, or tells a former teacher of his to go suck a duck, which is probably slang for something else, possibly with the same beginning letter and 4 letters, but probably just one different vowel. Harrison Ford singing Some Enchanted Evening was added in as well. These are all scenes that were originally shot for the film, but studio executives, for whatever reason, removed them. I think in the commentary track, Lucas mentions that the Harrison Ford singing Some Enchanted Evening was removed primarily because of concerns over, not movie rights, but music rights to that film. Because I think that song originally was in, I don't know if it was South Pacific maybe? And I don't remember if it was in the film or I think South Pacific was a play at one point in time, but the musical rights came into question, so executives, I presumably removed it for that reason. The car salesman and the Louie Louie dance sequence, I don't know why those were removed. In fact, Lucas mentions during his commentary track for the film that he's not sure why they would choose those two of all things to remove, and how that would possibly make the difference between abysmally bad and absolutely wonderful film. Looking at it, I think that the car salesman with Terry, it's a humorous moment, but maybe it's just because it's not narratively a huge progression. It's like a humorous moment, but it really is between Terry being in the car accident and him meeting Debbie, and it's not really necessary to the story. Of course, it's pretty short, so I don't know why they would take it out, really. I mean, it's kind of funny, in my opinion. Then again, I used to be a salesman, and so I kind of find it funny because it reminds me of some of my coworkers from years ago. The Louie Louie dance sequence, I don't know why that would be cut. I think they just, that's kind of like a Steve and Lori moment there. I guess they just decided it wasn't necessary, but I don't really know. There's also a difference that was introduced, I believe, in the 1998 special edition, where the earlier versions of the film, the opening shot had buildings in the background. And if you do some research, the Mel's Diner location was actually in Van Nuys or Van Ness. I don't know, it's spelled Van Ness, but I think they call it Van Nuys. I don't know why. Maybe I'm too Texan to understand why it's pronounced that way. But that's actually in downtown San Francisco, which is quite interesting because the film was supposed to be set in a small town. So for the 1998 special edition, I think they used computer McMagic or something to remove that and introduce what looked to be like a really beautiful sunset in a more rural location, because this is a story about small town America, and the background, I suppose the background just didn't really match Lucas's original creative vision. I think that the changes with the 2012, or I think it's 2011, the special edition DVD that I have, I think that they're all good. I think they're all improvements. I know that there's some people I know who are like Star Wars fans, for example. I think one of them actually, this dude I know, he has like a shirt that says "hand shot first," and so Lucas going back and changing his films is not universally accepted as wonderful. But I think that the changes that he made for American Graffiti are all really good. I think that they make the film better. I don't think that the scenes that he added in slow down the pacing, not in a noticeable way. I think it's perfectly fine. But these different alternative versions do exist. And I sometimes wonder if you were making a film, if studio executives came in and said, well, take out these scenes, like, is there any reason why they would take them out? I don't know. I can tell you that I've worked in the corporate world long enough to know that some managers just want to come in and make a bunch of changes, seemingly because they kind of seem like they have a need to be in control of something. It's probably the reason that they also buy really expensive sport cars that they can't afford and have a lot of other midlife behaviors. Maybe they're compensating for something. I don't know. Anyway, all in all, I don't think that the changes between the theatrical release and the collector's edition are huge. I do primarily like the changes that Lucas has made to his film and restoring it to what he originally wanted. So one of the things that I always do with any work of art, whether it's a film or a book, is I offer some sort of a critique of some kind. And one thing that's apparent to me about American Graffiti is actually something George Lucas mentioned in the director's commentary himself, which is that this film is actually, I guess you could say, quite dated, but it still holds its charm. Nevertheless, I feel the need to offer something more in the way of a critique. And so I have a little list here that I'm going to go down here. The social norms of the time are a bit dated compared to today's standards. The film was made back in the early 1970s and portrays a period of American history, or rather a time period of the early 1960s, which is even longer ago. Now, one of the characters does refer to the Wolfman as a not-so-nice racial term. That's how she refers to him. It's Carol's character at some point. It's also been noted, in fact, Lucas also mentions the fact that the title cards at the end are there for the male protagonist, but there's nothing there about the female characters at all. Although I'm not sure that there would be one for the Blonde and the T-Bird, since it's questionable whether or not she's even real. But that's certainly been brought up. And you could also make the point that the women characters are mainly used to discover and provide almost a mirror-like reflection to expose the issues that the male characters are not discovering about themselves, that they don't wish to face yet. And as a narrative device, that's not necessarily wrong if that's part of something, a full and complete story. But I don't know, I guess you could have that opinion. In some ways, I think that if you were to take someone like, say, John and Carol, that matchup, Carol is her own character with her own goals, trying to go after what she wants. And I think Laurie is also her own character in a way. I think it's kind of debatable whether that's really an issue or not. I'm not sure where I really stand on it. I'd say that I like the characters and I like the story. I imagine if it were made today that these characters would be at least a little bit different and that the story would be too. Now, one thing I can tell you is that the sock hop in the movie is something that I grew up in the South in the 90s, and I have no idea what incarnation this really is. To me, this was like looking into the lens of it might as well have been on Mars or something, because I mean, when I went to high school, there were like dances and things, but there was nothing like what I saw here in this particular film. It's like looking at footage from a foreign country. But in a way, I think that works. I'm kind of intrigued by it in a way. I'm intrigued by really this whole film because it's really just this glimpse into a world that no longer exists. Glimpsing into the past and seeing the fleeting glimpse of boomer glory days gone by. To me, that's really what the film is about. And while there certainly are social norms at the time that were not acceptable today, I think that to understand the past, you have to look at it in its entirety, not just the good parts about it, but the bad parts as well, warts and all. And I think when it comes to nostalgia, something I remember my grandmother telling me is that she kind of missed the past in that she missed things like handwritten letters, typewriters, but it doesn't mean that people from the past, that doesn't mean that they miss things like, I don't know, racism, sexism, other toxic things from the past. The glasses of nostalgia tend to be rose-colored and they tend to gloss over the bad things. And I guess that's really what nostalgia is about, looking at the past and having a favorable memory of it, but forgetting the fact that there are things about it that weren't so good. If I were to think back to the 90s, I remember there was one summer when the films Apollo 13, the third Die Hard movie, and a bunch of great films came out. But if I look at a list of films that came out that particular year, there's plenty of forgettable things. There's plenty of forgettable music, too. It's just that when we look back on the past, we tend to forget the things that we are not memorable, and we tend to have a unfairly favorable view of it. And in some ways, that's perhaps what this film is about in its own way, which is kind of interesting because in a meta sort of way, the fact that this film is dated is in fact what this film is about. But I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking things, as unusual as that might be. So where are they now, all the cast and crew of American Graffiti? John Brent, who played the car salesman, went on to play Ralph in more American Graffiti, and he was also in the films Pork Lips Now and First Family. Jan Dunn continued to act in other films such as No Small Affair and Shoot the Moon. Wolfman Jack, the legendary disc jockey, went on to act in a few other films such as Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Motel Hell. Scott Beach, who played Mr. Gordon, continued acting in films such as Stand By Me and Mrs. Doubtfire. According to what I found on the internet, in his spare time, Scott was an instrument builder. He created replicas of Renaissance musical instruments, which sounds really interesting. Jim Bohan continued to act in films such as Kings of the Hill and Phantom of the Paradise. Del Close, interestingly, was the second cousin of General of the Army and the President Dwight D. Eisenhower. He continued to act in film, theater, and as a director. He acted in the film Thief alongside James Caan and in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Joe Mixon continued acting in films such as Escape from Alcatraz, among others. Deborah Lee Scott played one of the girls who cruised around with Falfa, Harrison Ford, during the night and had the famous line, "Ain't he neat?" She continued to act as an actress. She was very prominent in the Police Academy films, and in the mid-1990s she became a talent manager for an agency in, I believe it was New York City. Johnny Weissmuller Jr. continued to act. Manuel Padilla Jr. continued acting. He appeared in Happy Days. He was in more American Graffiti. He was also in the film Scarface. Haskell Wexler went on to continue his career as a legendary cameraman and cinematographer and director. He won 2 Academy Awards for cinematography, one in 1966 for Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and one in 1976 for Bound for Glory, out of a total of 5 nominations. He also worked on Days of Heaven, which was a particularly well-shot film. In fact, it's revered among film circles as being particularly well-shot. And he had a career that spanned over 6 decades. James Cranon continued acting in films such as Time After Time and Mrs. Doubtfire. Al Nalbandian, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, I'm really bad at, I'm too Texan to pronounce certain words, I'm sorry y'all. He continued to act. He was in the film Invasion of the Body Snatchers, So I Married an Ex-Murderer, and Jack. Gloria Katz continued to write. She wrote and produced films such as Howard the Duck and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Chuck Dorset continued to act in films such as Angels in the Outfield and Die Laughing. Christopher Prey continued as an actor, appearing in films such as Mrs. Doubtfire, Junior, and Sudden Impact. Ty Curley continued to act in films such as The Days and Nights of Molly Dodd and The Great Outdoors. Bo Hopkins, who played Joe, went on to a very distinguished career. He was a very prolific actor, most notably Midnight Express. He continued to work as an actor, as recently as 2020. Suzanne Summers, who played the blonde in the T-Bird, appeared in Three's Company, Serial Mom. She was also in Step by Step, co-starring with the Patrick Duffy. She also co-hosted Candid Camera. Cindy Williams was a prominent actress within Hollywood, working right up until 2023. She appeared in films such as The Conversation. She married Bill Hudson and had 2 children. In 2015, her memoir, Surely I Jest, was published. Fred Roos continued his career as a legendary casting director within Hollywood. Prior to American Graffiti, he had worked on The Godfather with Francis Ford Coppola, if I recall correctly. He continued to work as a casting director for Godfather Part 2, Apocalypse Now, as well as many other films. He married Nancy Drew and had a son named Alexander Roos, who is now an actor. Lynn Marie Stewart, who played Bobby, was a member of the Groundlings, an improv and theater group based in Southern California. She also appeared as an actress in Pee-wee's Big Adventure and Running Man. Terrence McGovern went on to act in many films, as well as a prominent voice actor, including 2 Star Wars games. He even voiced Admiral Ackbar in one of the X-Wing games. I think it may have been the one that I played a long, long time ago. Impressively, he has over 151 credits listed on IMDb. Jan Bellin, who played Buddha, the car hop, starred in several films in the 1970s before seemingly retiring. Bo Gantry, who played Ants, continued to act in films such as Dirty Mary and Midnight Caller. Susan Richardson, who played Judy, went on to act in a TV series called 8 is Enough. Kathleen Quinlan went on to a wildly successful career as an actress. She acted in films such as The Doors and Breakdown. She went on to act in Apollo 13, which was directed by Ron Howard, one of the stars of this film. For her role in Apollo 13, she was nominated for an Academy Award. Harrison Ford returned to carpentry and never acted again. I'm just kidding. He went on to act in Star Wars, Indiana Jones, Blade Runner, The Fugitive, Witness. Harrison Ford went on to a remarkably successful career as an actor. Candy Clark continued to act in films such as Blue Thunder and also Zodiac. She auditioned for the role of Princess Leia in Star Wars but lost out to Carrie Fisher. Presumably during the filming, she befriended fellow actress Mackenzie Phillips. Mackenzie Phillips went on to star in a sitcom called One Day at a Time, also a television show called So Weird, and she also appeared in Orange is the New Black. She had a son in 1987. Richard Dreyfuss went on to a long and distinguished career as a legendary and incredible actor. He appeared in Jaws, The Goodbye Girl, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, What About Bob, Mr. Holland's Opus, and really just too many films to mention. Ron Howard continued acting, but primarily went on to direct and also do narration and voice work. He's the narrator of the television series Arrested Development. He's also a prominent producer. As a director, he directed the film Grand Theft Auto, which I believe was his first film as a director. He also directed Splash, Apollo 13, A Beautiful Mind, Solo, The Star Wars Story, and some Jurassic World films. He directed Kathleen Quinlan, as mentioned earlier in Apollo 13, who he shared a scene with in this film. His daughter, Bryce Dallas Howard, followed in her father's footsteps and is now an actress. And Ron Howard's really cool, by the way. Paul Lamont continued to act in a television series called Lonesome Dove. He was also in More American Graffiti, Melvin and Howard, a film called Death Valley, and he also appeared in American History X. There's also a YouTube interview of Paul Lamont, presumably from the 2010s. I think it's during some kind of Petaluma American Graffiti fan thing or car show or something. But he's very eloquent and he seems to be doing pretty well. Charles Martin Smith continued to act as well as direct and write. He appeared in More American Graffiti, Starman. I really like him in The Untouchables, which I have on DVD and rewatch usually about once a year. He also appeared in an X-Files episode, an episode for the television show Fringe. He was also in one of The Outer Limits, one of the 1990s ones. He directed a film called The Snowwalker, and he also directed Stone of Destiny. As of 2025, 18 feature-length films and television episodes have been directed by him, including an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and also an episode of Da Vinci's Inquest. Francis Ford Coppola, the producer of American Graffiti, met Lucas while filming The Rain People, although maybe it was earlier. I don't know. He continued to direct and produce films such as Apocalypse Now, Godfathers Part 2 and 3, and The Conversation, as well as The Outsiders, the 1992 version of Dracula. Recently, he made something called Megalopolis, or Megapolis, or Megaopolopolis. I don't know. I can't say it. I'm sorry, y'all. I'm too Texan. Willard Hurt continued to work as a writer. He wrote and produced films such as Howard the Duck and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Walter Murch, the sound supervisor, continued to work as a sound supervisor on films such as Apocalypse Now, The Conversation, The English Patient, and dozens of other films. George Lucas, the creator of this film, went on to create Star Wars, both the original trilogy and the prequel trilogy, as well as Indiana Jones, Red Tails. He also started a computer graphics division in California and sold it to Steve Jobs in the 1980s, which eventually turned into Pixar. There's, I think, a number of things that any kind of writer, director, or artist could conclude from looking at American Graffiti as a film. It really captures the essence and psychology of growing up. And although the film is in fact dated, there's things about growing up that are common to really every generation. And I often wonder if young people today and in the future will continue to see this film for what it is and really appreciate and understand the psychological core of the story. At its center is really the idea of having to leave what's familiar to find one's true calling. And as a film, one could say that art is in some ways a portrait of transformation. And that's certainly what I think George Lucas has done just in general. I make a point of rewatching this film at least once a year. And I always find the title cards at the end chilling and haunting, and it's a reminder that really everything eventually comes to an end. I saw George Lucas in a somewhat recent interview, in a public appearance, I suppose, and it does seem like he's getting up there. He's in his 80s, but I hope that we have him for a really long time because, well, he's created some very interesting art for all of us to appreciate. I know that some people I know, they're kind of a little, I guess you could say, unimpressed by the prequels and some of his other work. But one thing that's very clear to me when watching his work as a whole is that he's had a very strong and positive impact on storytelling and filmmaking, and was part of a very crucial part of the 1970s in which Hollywood had to reinvent itself and really think outside the box and change the way that we think about film. No matter what mistakes or imperfections George Lucas may have, none of that diminishes the exceptional work that he has created and left for the rest of us to enjoy in the years or decades or possibly centuries to come. I always find the very final images of this film, at a minimum, bittersweet. It shows the fear of change, but there's also an exciting promise at the same time. Lucas has this way of conveying in his work this idea of characters being at the crossroads of destiny, and it's a theme, a very powerful emotional theme that's carried over into Star Wars and some of his other work. Sometimes while seeing the end of this film, it reminds me that, while this is in fact a film about the baby boomers, every generation in a way has some sort of moment that defines the shattering of their worldview, the closing of the idyllic childhood and the abrupt appearance of reality. I remember when I was a kid, my grandmother told me about the attack on Pearl Harbor, and she could remember where she was. She was at her mother's house when the radio announcement came. My grandmother could remember every detail of that particular day for decades after it occurred. And for my parents' generation, they of course had very vivid memories about the JFK assassination, which is something that this film of course implies is going to happen to the boomers that will change their view of the world. For older millennials like me, really the September 11th attacks were a defining moment in which we kind of lost that idyllic worldview, although perhaps it never really existed to begin with. And I know that for young people today, the pandemic has sort of been a defining moment where it's sort of stripped away the illusion of childhood and had them face the abrupt and harsh nature of reality. The older I get, the more the final shot to me diminishes in nostalgia and grows hauntingly into something melancholy. As time slams shut the only door into the past, young people glean one final glimpse of Eden, and then it's gone.